Brilliant. So this image of the painting, as you can see, is it's an in situ photograph. And it is, of course, showing Hans Holbein the Younger's ambassadors, painted in 1533. And it is in its frame, and it is in the gallery. Now, I think coming to, what is it, the 8th week of lockdown, I'm really starting to feel sort of feel at a loss without the pictures that I'm working with nearby. And I just thought it was important to remind ourselves that these paintings that we're looking at are all in the National Galleries. In the National Gallery, they are objects before we look super, super close at this high resolution image. So who is this man on the left? So let's talk a bit more about him. So this is, as I say, a man called Jean de Dinteville. He was an ambassador to François Ier, so French King Francis I. And as ambassador of France to England, he came to England 5 times. Now, this was his second visit to England when this painting was painted. And he arrives at the beginning of 1533, the year the painting was painted, and he stays much longer than he wanted to, and he was incredibly unhappy here. But he's come, of course, on behalf of Francis I, the King of France, really at this incredible time of religious turmoil in Europe, because 1533, the year he arrives on this mission, was the year that Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn in May of this year, and hence divorced or annulled his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, his previous wife, and broke from the Catholic Church. Holbein had arrived in England the year before, but this was in fact his second mission to England, and he had come for the first time in 1526 for 2 years before returning to Basel, where he resided, and then returning again in 1532, and then he remained in England until his death in 1543. So Jean's here, he's unhappy, he's residing in Bridewell Palace, which was a palace, interestingly, I found out doing my research. If anyone knows Unilever House in Blackfriars, Bridewell Palace was Henry VIII's residence for several years, and it was on the site of Unilever House. And when he sort of moved over to Whitehall Palace, the ambassadors that came to England were often sort of put up in Bridewell Palace. And that is where this painting would have been painted. Down here on his dagger, we can see on the scabbard there is an age. So he has painted in also the age of the sitter. It says aetatis suae, or ait suae, abbreviation of aetatis, which means at the age of, or in the 29th year. So we know here that Jean de Dinteville is 28 years old. And another beautiful detail as we go down here is this incredible tassel. And what he does to execute this is he paints on top of the blue paint this kind of strange sort of glue type medium, which he then coats in gold leaf. So it gives you this real sense of 3-dimensionality on the tassel. And we can see down here these sort of overlapping threads of the tassel, just these tiny details just that make the painting sort of almost photographic. Now, I'm just going to move over to the second figure, who is, on first impressions, he kind of looks less, I find, sort of less interesting. He's not quite sort of, he's not shown in quite so much glory. But if we go closer, we actually can see that he is wearing this fantastic kind of mink fur lined coat or robe, and he has this incredible sort of damask, sort of echoing the green damask of the backdrop, but he has this incredible sort of dark brown purpley damask robe, which falls all the way down to the floor. Now, this is a man, as I say, called Georges de Selve. He is a bishop. He was the Bishop of Lavore, and he was also an ambassador to various other places, the Serenissima, Venice, but not to England. And we don't quite know why he's here and why he's portrayed in this picture. He was a close friend of Jean de Dinteville's, but we know that he was in England for just over a month. He arrives in mid-April and he's gone by the end of May. So he's in England around this time of year, and maybe to convey a message to Henry VIII from the king in France, or perhaps to the ambassador. So this probably the most baffling thing about this painting is these objects that we can see in the middle. Now, sort of to summarize, really, the objects on the top shelf relate to the heavens. They are instruments that are used to understand the heavenly bodies or celestial bodies. And that makes very much sense that they're on the top shelf. And then, of course, on the bottom shelf, we have these very earthly things. Now, this is probably most evidently seen in these globes. So we can see this celestial globe on top and this terrestrial globe beneath it. So I'm just going to start on the bottom shelf, because each of these objects has a little story to tell. And I think I'm just going to do it like that for now. But it has been argued that the objects on either side of the shelf relate to the two figures standing either side. Now, the argument for this is, I think, quite strong, in that the globe, the terrestrial globe we can see, so I actually am going to zoom in a little bit, because you do need to see the text on the globe. In fact, it is incredibly detailed. So it's probably based on a map from the 1530s. This is, a matter of years before, matter of decades before Francis Drake does his thing in the Elizabethan period. So this is really a time of exploring and adventuring. So maps and cartography were hugely of great interest at this time. And of course, they express your sort of learnedness, your education. And worldliness. And we can see here, so if you can make it out from this slightly bastardized map of Europe, this is England, Scotland, Scotia, and Ireland depicted here sort of upside down. And then we can see Francia here. And Holbein's chosen just to mark just a couple of place names. So we have Normandy, we have Britannia, which suggests, and Barris with a B. So it sort of suggests that Holbein didn't quite sort of confer with his patron about the names of these places, perhaps. So perhaps he did have a bit more of a free hand in this painting than we think. He perhaps didn't have Jean looking over his shoulder for every element or every aspect of the painting. But what's interesting is here at the bottom we can see this word policy. Now that in fact was the place that Jean de Dinteville had his chateau in France, in the sort of Burgundy region. And it's very strange that it's one of just I think under 10 place names that are located on this terrestrial globe. Now, the reason we think that there are a number of sort of clues to the political current, perhaps, or the religious and political current at the time, is because we have this beautiful lute. And now we can see it closely. We can see that it has the string of this lute here, which is broken, and we can see rather beautifully the sort of ping of the other end of the string hanging off the bottom there. So immediately we have a sense of discord, quite literally, from this beautifully depicted lute, painted at a foreshortened, at a sort of 3/4 angle. So we get this sense of it being foreshortened or shown sort of in depth. And added to which, we have this flute case, this case of flutes. There are room for 5 flutes there. We can see that from the lid of the case. And there is, of course, one missing. So again, this sense of lack of harmony. We have this amazing celestial globe. We can see here Galaxia, which is a reference to the Milky Way. And we can see all of these different constellations, which are then, of course, kind of outlined with these amazing astronomical depictions or objects or figures or animals. And I absolutely love, if you zoom right up close, just the way he has managed to give us a sense of the depth in these incised lines in this wooden globe. But what is interesting is we have this celestial shelf, we have this earthly shelf, and it was common in Renaissance portraits for sitters to be displayed with objects of learning or objects that were sort of hints to their status or their profession. But these are, to an extent, we've seen they're related, but it seems too much of a good thing that there is this celestial level, there is this earthly level, and then there is what was once described as potentially a cuttlefish bone across the front of the painting. Now, talk about not talking about the elephant in the room, and that is this incredibly beautiful anamorphic composition of a skull. It took a while for scholars to figure out what exactly it was, but this is a skull that has been painted in perspective, in a kind of warped perspective across the bottom of this painting. Now, it isn't as strange as it looks, in the sense that this process, or this technique of anamorphosis, was actually quite popular in the 16th century. And we don't know exactly how it was done, but it's likely that it was that an object was potentially squared and then sort of reconfigured, or that an object was drawn and then illuminated against a wall or a surface, so that you could get a kind of warped outline of the object, depending on the angle of the light that you shone on the drawing. But it certainly shows the artist's skill in depicting a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions. And the reason I say it's relevant on these 3 levels is, of course, because this is a human skull. Now, if anyone feels brave enough and wants to turn off their camera or leave it on, if you look at the painting, and it's such a shame we can't stand in front of it, but from the side of your computer, so from the right-hand side, and line your eye up with the top of the skull and sort of look down the screen, sort of along the screen at the front, you might get a sense of this skull sort of hovering in midair. And equally, if you did it from sort of beneath and up. Now, a skull was, of course, another element in still life. It was often included in still life paintings as what we call a memento mori, which is a symbol of death, or a symbol reminding us that life is fleeting. So, of course, as this 3rd level in this painting, we do have death and, you know, the underworld and the end. So we have this skull which kind of sits out from the rest of the painting. It is a reminder of death, which is, of course, sort of so obvious to us, but also disappears at the same time. And I think that's kind of rather beautiful. Not only in his painting, he makes this skull there in clear sight, but it also kind of just meshes into everything else, and we sort of forget about it. And I think that's rather a lovely reference to, of course, this impending end that we all know is there, but perhaps don't think about. Now, to counterpoise that, there is this amazing silver crucifix, executed just so beautifully. And we have, of course, a reminder of salvation, and that even though death does eventually reach us, of course, something that unites the church is this reminder that we have salvation beyond that. And I think that is probably almost the sort of strongest message of them all, and was one that was believed by both sides, both the Puritans and the Catholics alike.